Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Neil Woodrow. Here are today's top stories. Forced TV confession victims hail the revoke of CGTN's broadcasting licence. The UK plans to require travellers to quarantine in a hotel from February 15th. Posing as journalists, 3 alleged Chinese spies have been expelled from Britain. The UK government plans to make arrivals from red list countries isolate in approved quarantine hotels for 10 days. The Labour Party criticised the plans. Eddie Aitken explains.
Overseas arrivals are already required to self-isolate in Britain for 10 days, but enforcement is patchy. There are also worries as hotel industry leaders say they haven't been given enough preparation time. The Foreign Office Minister says,
"This is adding to an existing package of measures which requires a test before departure, requires a notification form upon departure, already requires 10 days of quarantine." So this is adding to existing measures.
With so many arrivals to the UK all needing accommodation, one hotel executive says,
"There's about 2,000 people arriving per day at Heathrow, Gatwick and Manchester from the quarantine countries. So for 10 days, that's 20,000 rooms. So that's potentially 200 hotels with 100 rooms in each. That's the sort of scale we're talking about."
The government is expected to start the new rules from February 15th. Current lockdown rules bar Britons from taking foreign holidays, although essential travel is allowed. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
The World Anti-Doping Agency said on Friday that athletes can take COVID-19 vaccines without fear of breaching anti-doping rules.
And we have no reason to believe that there would be any interference of the vaccines with an anti-doping test. I mean, there are several reasons for that. First of all, the technology that is being used. Vaccines are not new, of course, and we know what an immune reaction is.
He says even if some vaccines utilize new technology, this doesn't violate the agency's rules against doping. The agency says it's making sure that there's no cross-reaction between post-vaccine proteins and anti-doping tests. French Prime Minister Jean Castex says the situation in France remains fragile, but he says for the moment there's no need for a new national lockdown. NTD's Joanna Conway has more.
Castex says the rate of COVID infections hasn't increased significantly over the past 2 weeks. The daily recorded average stands at 20,000 new cases, 1,600 new hospital admissions and 320 deaths.
A new lockdown will be seen as a last resort, and the situation doesn't justify it. As of today, our rates of infection are admittedly high, but it's still lower than what it was last October.
France expects its first delivery of the AstraZeneca vaccine by the end of this week. Its target is 4 million inoculations by the end of the month. The most vulnerable people will be the first to get the jab.
Our goal is clear. We want to limit as much as possible the spread of these variants, to gain back time to be able to vaccinate and protect the most fragile among us.
But a leading health official calls for new restrictions. She says the 6 p.m. curfew levels off the new infections.
If we really want to break the epidemic curve, and at one point the plateau will really be too high, so yes, it will lead to a lockdown.
Many sectors have taken a hit because of the lockdown. On Thursday, workers across France took to the streets calling for better salaries and more job protection. Joanna Conway, NTD News.
In France, restaurant owners challenging mandatory closures risk backlash from the government. NTD correspondent David Vivers met a chef who finds himself under surveillance by the intelligence services for reopening.
Stéphane Turillon is one of 200,000 restaurant owners in France. Like his peers, he had to close his restaurant, La Source Bleue, for around 6 months in 2020. In mid-January, he told us he would be inviting all restaurateurs to reopen in defiance of the mandatory closures.
It's the government that led me to bankruptcy because it makes me ask for more bank loans instead of letting me welcome people in a safe way.
He invited hundreds of people to meet at La Source Bleue on February 1st, but most were blocked by police. Here is what he told us today on the telephone.
1 hour before opening, the head of police in the region ordered police forces to deploy around my restaurants.
Earlier this week, the French Minister for Economy and Finance said restaurant and bar owners face sanctions and suspension of their government aid for reopening. According to Turillon, there's almost no chance that a restaurant owner will challenge the mandatory closure, as they need the government financial help to survive. He also says he's under pressure by the police for his attempt at reopening.
When I opened my restaurant, the Territorial Intelligence Police wanted to talk to me. They also sent special investigation police forces to watch over me this day. A friend of mine told me I was on the S list.
S list means that Turillon poses a threat to the nation. The other people on this list are usually potential terrorists. According to restaurants' unions, 65% of restaurant owners fear they will go bankrupt this year if lockdown measures aren't lifted. David Vives, NTD, Paris.
Some Uyghur Muslims claim that members of their community are being deported to China in exchange for CCP virus vaccines. The country is largely reliant on the Chinese-developed Sinovac vaccine, and no doses have been delivered despite China's promises. NTD's Earl Rhodes has the details.
Uyghur Muslims in Turkey say they fear for their future.
It's not just me. Everyone is afraid of being extradited. We live in anxiety. We want our Turkish brothers here to speak out about this.
Opposition lawmakers in Turkey accuse Ankara's leaders of selling out Uyghurs to China in exchange for COVID-19 jabs. China promised tens of millions of vials of vaccine to Turkey. They haven't been delivered yet, and they haven't given any explanation. China has signed a treaty with Turkey, which Beijing wants to use to speed up the return of some refugees and Uyghurs under the name of terrorism.
If the Turkish parliament doesn't sign the extradition treaty with China, we are wondering that China will say that they won't send us the requested vaccines. And as long as the question isn't answered, this concern and suspicion won't soothe the public.
Lawmakers say Turkish police have raided and detained 50 Uyghur Muslims in recent months. It's a sharp uptick from last year. Rising fears are already prompting an influx of Uyghurs moving to Germany, the Netherlands and other European countries. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
2 women and a man were killed in linked attacks in Kilmarnock, Scotland, leading to a 3-hour lockdown of a hospital and a nearby main street. Police say a 39-year-old woman was attacked in the car park of University Crosshouse Hospital at 7:45 in the evening. 20 minutes later, a second woman, 24, was fatally stabbed about 2 miles away. At about 8:30 in the evening, a 40-year-old man died in a road crash on the outskirts of town. Police Scotland say the incidents are thought to be connected, and the attacks are not thought to be terrorism-related. And Scotland's top civil court declines to rule that Scottish Parliament has the right to call an independence referendum without London's permission. The Court of Session in Edinburgh says it's premature and hypothetical to challenge Prime Minister Boris Johnson's power to block a new vote. But with the Scottish National Party set for a big win in local elections on the promise of a second referendum, the fate of the Union of Scotland and the rest of the UK is by no means assured. To stray from the Union, the UK Parliament must agree to grant Scotland's government powers to make the vote valid. Johnson says the 2014 referendum was a once-in-a-generation vote and has ruled out granting permission of another. 2 former victims of forced confessions in China say they are relieved after UK regulator Ofcom revokes the broadcast licence for CCP-controlled CGTN. Earl Rhodes has more.
Peter Humphrey celebrates the ruling by regulator Ofcom to ban Chinese state-owned broadcaster CGTN.
Seeing the license revoked today is a moment of triumph, not only for me, but also for all the other victims of this type of abuse, including many Chinese people.
CGTN broadcast a forced confession with Humphrey that was filmed during his 2-year imprisonment in China. Humphrey says that he was drugged, tied to a chair and put in a cage when a police officer interrogated him, adding that CGTN, which broadcasts in English, completely misrepresented the situation in its report. Humphrey says his son, who was 18 at the time, was traumatised by what he saw.
They want global narrative about China and what's happening in China and so forth, through the twists that they put on their coverage. They do it through sheer distortion and lies.
Ofcom argued that since CGTN is fully controlled by the CCP, it cannot broadcast here, since UK broadcasting law doesn't allow political entities to hold licences. CGTN, whose European headquarters are in London, called Ofcom's ruling manipulated by extreme right-wing organisations and anti-China forces.
Ofcom's decision on revoking the licence of CGTN is historically significant. It is clear that the mouthpiece of CCP totalitarian regime will no longer have a foothold in the UK.
Cheng was abducted in 2019 to extract information about the Hong Kong protests. He said he was tortured and forced to confess to have solicited prostitution. Cheng says watching his forced confession on CGTN caused him great distress. Humphrey expects Ofcom to hand out more penalties to CGTN over his and Cheng's complaints. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
Support is growing for a proposed law seeking to prevent the UK from making trade deals with countries committing genocide. That's according to the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Foreign Affairs. He spoke with NTD's Jane Werrell about the crucial vote in the Commons next week.
To Yorkshire with
Imran Ahmad Khan is one of the core people behind the so-called Genocide Amendment. If passed, the amendment will give the right to UK courts to determine if a country is committing genocide.
Britain must have the courage and confidence to resist evil, as this country proudly has in the past. When Churchill's Britain stood alone against totalitarian evil for 9 months in 1940, completely alone in the world. It was not easy, nor was it without cost, but it was the right thing to do and our finest hour.
The amendment requires Parliament to hold a debate to set out its next course of action if a country is found guilty of genocide.
A number of my colleagues have stated that the designation of genocide should only be determined through the international courts. However, you and I know, we all know, that China and other states would veto and block any designation from being allowed to take place. We cannot, and we should not, we must not allow those who commit crimes against humanity from being protected by the deficiencies of our still developing international system.
The UK government has argued that the amendment is unnecessary and ineffective, but Khan says there's significant and growing support from both houses for the amendment. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
The Telegraph newspaper reports that in the past year, 3 Chinese spies who falsely posed as journalists have been expelled from Britain. A senior Whitehall source told the newspaper that 3 spies each claimed to work for 3 different Chinese media agencies. It's understood they all set foot in the UK in the past 12 months. According to the Telegraph, their true identities were uncovered by MI5 and they have since been forced to return to China. Teachers joined the protest against the military coup in Burma, also known as Myanmar. They gathered in the country's biggest city, Yangon. NTD's Earl Rhodes has the story.
The campaign, started by doctors, is joined by government workers, students, youth groups and now teachers. One lecturer says,
"We aim to halt the administrative system. We are now holding a peaceful strike called the Civil Disobedience Campaign, which aims to not cooperate with this government."
The group chant, "Mother Sue, be healthy, may the military dictatorship fail." This lecturer says,
"We don't want this military coup which unlawfully seized power from our elected government. We don't want anyone who steals power and then forms their own government. We are no longer going to work with them. We want the military coup to fail."
The UN Security Council calls for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and others. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
The EU's foreign minister meets with Russia's foreign minister, calling for Putin critic Alexei Navalny's release and an investigation into his poisoning. Joanna Conway has more.
EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says his visit coincided with the arrest and sentencing of Navalny and the arrest of thousands of demonstrators, which prompted frank and intense talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov agreed that relations were not at their best.
We have reviewed today's state of the relations between Russia and the European Union in detail. It's true they are not at their best, including due to one-sided illegitimate restrictions which are introduced by the EU under trumped-up pretexts.
Borrell says they had to recognise their fundamental differences and lack of trust in recent years, seeing each other as competitors rather than partners. He further stated EU expectations.
As you can expect, I have conveyed to Minister Lavrov our deep concern and reiterated our appeal to his release on the launch of an impartial investigation over his poisoning.
Navalny was jailed earlier this week for almost 3 years for parole violations and is now facing a slander charge that is currently punishable by up to 2 years in jail. But his lawyer says he cannot face a custodial sentence because the alleged crime was committed before the law was changed to make it a jailable offence. Joanna Conway, NTD News.
French cultural venues have been closed for months due to the pandemic, but that didn't deter 106-year-old French pianist Colette Mays from recording her 6th album. NTD's Eddie Aitken has the story.
Mays was born in 1914 and has been playing piano for over a century. She says she began to love the piano because her mother was very strict.
My inspiration was first of all tenderness, which was lacking at home. I found this in the work of Schumann, maybe also in the work of Chopin, but Schumann was even more tender.
Mays lives in a tall building near the Eiffel Tower in Paris. She says she looks to the clouds for inspiration and her energy to keep playing comes from love of life.
We have to look at life. Without that, we're stuck between two doors. We have to look at life incessantly. It's beautiful.
Mays says music is more important for her than any type of food.
That's my food for the spirit and for the heart.
Mays' son sees his mother as an inspiration for others.
Her good mood, her joy, her love of life brings people a smile in worrying times like the one that we're now living through.
Mays started recording albums in 1998, with a first release in 2001. She is now preparing a 3-disc album releasing in April. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
That's all for now. Till next time.